Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is An Chung-young, professor at the Graduate School of International Studies at Jung-ang University. This afternoon, I'm really honored to moderate this important session. I am really delighted to have our distinguished panelists, basically from almost major corners of the world. Let me introduce the panelists each by calling their names and present position. In alphabetical the order, first, the Professor He-yun. Why don't you wave your hand? Okay. Please welcome them. And Professor He-yun is professor at the Graduate School of International Studies at Jeju University, a very well-known trade economist in Korea. Second, Dr. Jagannath Panda. He's joining us online, and originally from India, now head of the Stockholm Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs at the Institute for Security and Development Policy, Sweden. He is one of the most active security experts. Next, Mr. Jeff Schott, Senior Research Fellow at the prestigious Peterson Institute for International Economics. He is one of the most influential trade economists in Washington, D.C. And he is also very influential in shaping up the trade policy toward South Korea. Last but not least, the Professor of International Trade at Waseda University, Sujiro Urata. Okay, nice to see you online. Professor Urata is also a very well-established trade economist and gentleman. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining this program. Well, as everybody knows, the world is now entering an unprecedented inflection point in modern history caused by the pandemic and the subsequent unstable cross-border supply chain and direct investment. Then geo-economic fragmentation by increasingly intensifying US-China rivalry and, of course, ongoing Russian invasion to Ukraine. In particular, we observed the US and China are scrambling for technological hegemony. As a result, both countries have been taking occasionally unilateral, coercive, protectionist trade policies. Especially for the US, it is almost inconceivable to think of the US government provide direct subsidy to private firms during the liberal trade era. Against this backdrop, are we heading to some degree of a Kindelberger trap in international geoeconomic landscape in a multipolar world? Amid this turbulent and fragmented world, Yoon Suk-yeol government of South Korea declared in December last year South Korea's Indo-Pacific Diplomatic Manifesto, deviating substantially from previous government's strategic ambiguity in managing intensifying rivalry between the US and China to a strategic clarity by aligning clearly with the United States in core values of freedom and peace. However, South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy added a new component, namely prosperity component, to the US-initiated free and open Indo-Pacific, not to decouple completely from China. Through South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy, South Korea envisions a role of global pivotal state with like-minded countries in realizing the three core values and implementation principle based on fair trade, inclusivity, and mutual respect between economies in the Indo-Pacific and even beyond. With these introductory remarks, how would each panel member assess South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy? Does South Korea have enough muscle and support from like-minded regional economies to play a role of global pivotal state? What would be major challenge for South Korea would face to accomplish these objectives? Well, this is sort of the first round. I would like to give each panelist a maximum 3 minutes, okay, to assess a overall evaluation of the South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy. Let me start with first Jeff Schott. Would you like to share the American perspective on the South Korea's new Indo-Pacific strategy?
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to the East Asia Foundation for inviting me to participate in this very distinguished panel. It's always a pleasure to come back to the Jeju Forum and to participate in person. But I will not be giving you the American perspective. I will give you an American perspective by someone who is not in the government. The first thing I think to say is that the Korean Indo-Pacific strategy is a coherent approach and consistent with the policy of the Korean government over the past few decades to build integration arrangements with neighboring countries, including the United States, including China, including the ASEAN, and others. And this is the foundation for the new strategy that was announced last December. So I think it is one of inclusiveness and one of trying to build relationships and promote trade and investment across the region. The United States had a similar approach to economic integration in the Asia-Pacific region, and it was encapsulated in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But for growing domestic political reasons that raised questions about maintaining the U.S. leadership and openness on trade, something that appeared off and on during the long period between the conclusion of the Chorus FTA negotiations and the actual implementation of the agreement over that long 5-year period. I think that complexity and friction in U.S. politics has led the United States to be much more cautious in dealing with the region, and particular in its relations with China. And that, of course, creates the tension for U.S.-Korean relations because Korea is immersed in the region. The United States is on a very limited scale trying to create a de-risking or limitation of what can be done with China. My last word on this, though, is this is not that much different from what was already happening even before the U.S.-China trade war started. Because of the developments in China, rising prices in China, growing regulation and oppressive regulation of private enterprises by the Chinese government, there had been a movement already by private firms in in China to move out as part of their own supply chain resilience strategy. And this happened long before the current policies have been implemented by the Biden administration.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff, for your the very fresh reassessment, emphasizing a conventional U.S.-Korea relationship. Now, let me invite the Professor Sujiro Urata. How you see your neighbor South Korea's initiative on the Indo-Pacific strategy? I mean, how Japan would view this Korea's new strategy.
Sorry. Yes. First of all, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to participate, although virtually, in a very important forum. And I'd like to thank particularly Professor An for inviting me. And as for the Korean Indo-Pacific strategy, I think this is a very good one. I read the document with a lot of interest, and I found this strategy very consistent with Japan's Indo-Pacific initiative called Free and Open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP, or FOIP. There are many points in this Korean document which I liked and which I agree with. For example, I like the message that Korea is aspiring to become a global pivotal state, as Professor An just explained. And furthermore, I'm very happy to see the sentences that show friendly and favorable attitude toward Japan, thanks to President Yoon. But I'd like to make 2 points. The first point is that I'd like to know about the specific programs or projects that Korean government is planning to implement to accomplish the objectives indicated in the strategy, which includes achieving free, peaceful, and prosperous Indo-Pacific, again, as Professor An told us. On this point, I'm happy to read a sentence in the concluding section of the document that states that Korean government will prepare detailed implementation plans based on this Indo-Pacific strategy. I'm very anxious to know about these plans, which will be, I guess, presented later. But in this process, I'd like to see collaboration or cooperation with Japan and other countries, with like-minded countries. And this is the first point. And the second point that I'd like to make is the continuation of this strategy. I kind of hate to say this, but in the past, there was a case or several cases where strategies of Korean government changed with the change in the Korean presidents. And of course, I like to see the continuation of this very important strategy. And I'd like here, I guess I'd like to ask Professor An about the possibility of the maintaining this strategy even in the next presidency. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much. And after all, this is still, in conceptual stage, and the Korean government is now shaping up detailed strategy after listening your wisdom. Okay, and then next, let me invite the Dr. Panda. And so, how you view is, Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy? Seems to me very ambitious, outreaching, many corners of the world, not only the Asia-Pacific, but many parts of the world, the European countries, and even Latin American countries.
Professor Han, thank you very much for that kind introduction and kind invitation. Pleasure to be in this panel. And it's been long since I spoke in the Jejuporam, and good to be back here. And thank you very much to the Secretariat and particularly you, Professor Ahn, for this kind invitation. It's great pleasure to be here with the great economist and really tall personalities in the panel. You're right. I think South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy is quite ambitious. But at the same time, what I do see here in the Indo-Pacific strategy document is that there is not only greater clarity, but also there are focused areas what South Korea is envisioning to look for in times to come. And I think there are several areas we need to really look at it. One is that I think the current Indo-Pacific strategy of the Yoon government is an extension of the previous government. If we see under the Moon government, there was a new southern policy of the Moon government, which focused a lot on ASEAN and India. Under the Yoon government, when we are talking about the Indo-Pacific strategy, this is an extension to look beyond the Southeast Asian regions, beyond the ASEAN region. So ASEAN, India becomes not only the core component of Yoon's Indo-Pacific strategy, but also there are several areas like multilateral institutions, maritime issues, and engaging with smaller, middle-ranked, and major countries in the regions have been the cornerstone of Yoon's Indo-Pacific strategy. The second aspect is that I think the Indo-Pacific strategy of the current Yoon government's approach is to focus more on new supply chain networks. And I think pandemic has taught a lesson, including South Korea, many other major economies learned this lesson, that there is a need to diversify the supply chain networks. There is a need to look beyond the China-oriented economic integration model. And there is a need to look beyond the US-China rivalry and US-China economic dominance. I think from that point of view, there is a focus about how to connect with the regional economies, particularly with the major and middle power economies in the Indo-Pacific region, in the ASEAN regions to South Asian regions. The third critical component I do see in Yoon's Indo-Pacific strategy is about the technological cooperations that South Korea is envisioning with the regions. And I think that is critical, given the kind of powerhouse South Korea is on the technological field. And I think there many countries comes as a natural partner. I'm happy to see that there is a lot of good things are happening between Japan and South Korea. South Korea-Japan relations are really returning to normal. But more importantly, South Korea's engagement with India, South Korea's engagement with Australia, South Korea's engagement with many other countries in the regions in the Indo-Pacific are a positive indications. So therefore, technological cooperation will continue to be one of the driving force behind South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy. The last point I think that we need to note in South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy is, I think, the emphasis of Yoon government's focus to factor into the maritime issues and the maritime trade. And I think that is one of the critically significant factor that is emerging between South Korea and India particularly. For long, I think South Korea and India are discussing how to have a much more coastal belt oriented cooperation, maritime based cooperations. That has not really taken off for many regions. And I think this document and this strategy of Indo-Pacific by the Yoon government will give some kind of fillip to the South Korea-India relations in the regions, while pushing forward South Korea's engagement with the other Quad countries and the Indo-Pacific countries. And that's a definitely welcome context in the context of the Indo-Pacific power politics.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Panda. You brought up the possibility of expanding South Korea's relationship, a lot of the middle power nations, specifically with India, and also you touched upon the maritime collaboration in terms of the security aspect. Now, the Professor He Yoon, you and I, in a sense, thinking about the feasibility of the Korea's role of the pivotal state in the Indo-Pacific. So after hearing, the comment from the three gentlemen, how you feel now? Are you comfortable with the idea of government initiative?
Yes, I think the initiative is very ambitious and bold. And I think because of this strategy, the continuity and predictability of Korea's foreign policy is definitely enhanced. And the Yoon government is highlighting the role of Korea and actually shifting it from passive conformer to the pivotal state. In other words, highlighting the active role of Korea as a node or hub of multi-layered networks of plurilateral architecture. So yes, I think this is, the first and most ambitious global strategy that the Korean government announced so far. But however, still I have a concern that in this world of geo-economic fragmentation, and as we know that the yard gets smaller and fence gets higher, and also a more effective strategy to counter the possible China's economic coercion is not ready. So still my concern is that the maneuverable space for Korea to exercise its strategic autonomy is getting limited. And because Professor An also mentioned and highlighted the importance of middle power coalition, so I'd like to briefly touch upon middle power coalition. And yes, like-minded middle powers cannot wait for the United States to take the lead and reclaim the mantle. Indeed, uncoordinated industrial policies and consequent subsidy war by the United States, EU, and China have increased the business and transaction cost all over the world. And that is the reality. And amid the rising protectionism, Professor An, you also mentioned that middle powers should be able to display some strategic autonomy in dealing with this deglobalizing trend by superpowers. I fully agree with you, but still, my question is, can a consortium of middle power countries, can they fill in the gap of the United States? As United States abdicates the leadership responsibility to provide global public goods, can they pool their collective strength to pressurize on G2 and safeguard the rules-based liberal order? Honestly, I'm quite skeptical about it. Why? Because the deglobalization trend has been nurtured by the changed and changing landscape of domestic politics, and especially domestic politics in United States and Western countries. The public's voting behavior changed, and that brought about nationalism, and anti-trade and anti-immigration sentiments are in the center of economic nationalism. And the factors underlying this new economic nationalisms are China shock, that more countries are getting more and more dependent upon China, technology shock, there is a digital divide, and immigration fear. So because these factors are working in domestic politics and constrained trade policy strongly. So my argument is that, unless these domestic constraints are relieved, okay, it is very difficult to expect the full restorations of all the free trade regime.
Okay.
That's the point that I have. So actually, this kind of globalization divide is important in policy implementations, choice of policy. So to address this globalization divide, I think inclusive trade policy for those who suffered and alienated from globalization process would be very helpful. And last point is that what I think is that, well, maybe decades of sufferings from this derailed global trading system and the setbacks and repercussions from continued protectionism will somehow gather the momentum for us to try to restore the rules-based multilateralism.
Okay, I think some of these issues you brought up, domestic politics and protectionism, so on, will come up as a next discussion on the agenda. All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for the first round. You did the assessment, and now let us move on to the next issue. Huh? Yeah. Okay. This is a very intriguing question, especially to the economist. The ever-intensifying inward-looking protectionism by the U.S. and China, they've been often using the logic of security trade nexus and some geopolitical reasons. For example, China has frozen South Korea's cultural product into China for the security reasons after deployment of THAAD. And also China restrict outflow of Chinese tourists into South Korea. The US has also adopted the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIP Act to protect American industries by giving great favors to American companies and setting up the various guardrails against China for the security reasons. Well, of course, security is crucial to maintain a national sovereignty, but I feel the security trade nexus has been overly used to apply protectionist trade policies. How do we draw the line between the security-sensitive product and the ordinary tradable goods? I think I've been very much annoyed by the U.S. policy citing various trade restrictive measures, citing that, this is for security reasons. Okay, Dr. Panda, you are the expert on this security international politics. How do you see the political economy involved in this security trade nexus? Okay, yeah, please say limit within 3 minutes, something like that. Yeah. Even
thank you very much.
Perhaps NATO framework, how. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor An. I think there are 3 points I would like to make. One is that when it comes to the new economic environment that is emerging post the pandemic and particularly after the Ukraine war, I think there is a need for diversification, and that caters to the interest of the middle power coalition that you were talking about earlier. If we talk about the South Korea's positioning in global politics today, it can be a middle power, it can be a major power. Major power for the simple fact that it is a major economy in the world politics. It is a middle power today because its foreign policy is expanding. It has power to influence the global narrative in many areas, if not all, in all areas. And I think that is one of the most important aspects to understand, that South Korea today is a critical, pivotal state in world politics. There can be debates, we can differ, we may not agree about the influence of South Korea, but when it comes to technology, when it comes to investment, when it comes to new supply chain networks contributing to this network. South Korea is a critical economy in world politics, and that should not be overlooked in terms of the post-pandemic economic environment. Now, the second point here is that when we're talking about the supply chain networks, and I think it is critical for South Korea to stay engaged with both middle-ranked economies and lower-ranked economies. Of course, South Korea is very much well connected with major economies like United States of America, Japan, including China, which is an adversarial country to many countries in the world politics today. But at the same time, I think what we are seeing an increasing pattern is the South Korean investment coming to Southeast Asia, South Korean investment coming to India, and to many other outside regions in Asia, outside of Asia. And I think that's a positive trend in South Korean foreign policy. And given the current world economic environment, we need much more concrete engagement and South Korean investment coming to the poorer regions or to the developing region. The third point, I think, defense trade. And this is where I would bring my security component into account. South Korea is emerging as a critical defense manufacturing industrial hub. And I think the middle-ranked economies, the emerging economies, should not miss out this fact that today South Korea can be one of the major arms exporter to world politics. Of course, many can debate by saying that South Korea is not a nuclear power. But if we see in terms of defense manufacturing industry, it is a major significant power in terms of creating arms, ammunitions, battle tank, be it submarine technologies or technologies which will cater into the modern defense industries. And I think that is a critical area where South Korea could actually stay connecting with the major economies, minor economies, including the middle-ranked economies. And I think there, South Korea and India especially are emerging as greater partner. And I think in that context, UN government's Indo-Pacific strategy is very comprehensive, but yes, at the same time, it is very ambitious. A lot of areas needs to be taken forward to achieve those realistic targets, South Korea as a pivotal state.
Okay, thank you. Jeff, U.S. has restricted the South Korea's export of the advanced chips to China. And I think there is really some blurry line between the high-tech and ordinary, tradable goods, and also between military and the civilian technology. It's very now difficult to distinct each other. Sometimes I think the U.S. policy in this regard is very arbitrary and unilateral tools under the name of the security and trade nexus. So, who decide in the U.S. the sophistication of semiconductor subject to the control? How South Korea should respond to this, the dynamics of security and trade nexus?
Well, the first thing to take into consideration is we're talking about a very limited set of products and technologies that are subject to export controls. This is different from the type of protectionist measures that the Trump administration imposed on steel under the banner of national security, which had nothing to do with national security. And it's a shame that those restrictions are still in force. Very difficult politically for the Biden administration to remove them, given the bipartisan support for steel protectionism in the U.S. Congress. But when you're dealing with advanced technologies that have military capabilities, then it is very difficult and increasingly difficult to draw the line that you're asking to be drawn. Because a wide range of goods that have commercial application can be used for military applications. as we're seeing now with the drones that are being used to bomb Ukraine. So this is not an easy issue for the U.S. government in trying to determine what are the capabilities that have to be impeded. We're talking about impeding advances in technological innovations, somewhat like what was done during the Cold War with Russia. You're trying to set controls that will slow the pace of technological innovation so that there is a continued deterrent impact on the military side to prevent the type of actions taken by China that have been taken by Russia. Russia really broke the glass on the nexus of national security and normal commercial activity when it basically took invaded Ukraine. And now any instance where you have vulnerability because of the concentration of production and trade is become suspect for being used for coercive action. And I think those are the two areas that China is being targeted, unfortunately, are two areas of great economic engagement between Korea and China. And so that's where we have to try to figure out what is the sensible policy in the short term and over time that will allow the growth in the U.S.-Korea relations and not impede the innovation of Korean firms that has been such an important contributor to regional and global growth.
Oh, boy, thank you very much. Your comment. Professor Urata, in response to the U.S. Trade the restrictions, especially on the advanced semiconductors, so on, Chinese now is using the weaponizing the strategic materials, and for example, the rare earths and then cobalt and urea solutions, so forth. And Japan is very heavily depends on the supply from the China's strategic material. How Japan, would like to respond on this security and the trade, nexus?
Thank you very much. Well, before responding to this specific question that Professor Ahn raised about how Japan is trying to deal with this in China, I'd like to say a few words about the U.S. policy, if I may. As Jeff said, I kind of took his message that there's a kind of disguised protectionism, particularly in the case of like steel and aluminum, using this national security as an excuse to protect the domestic industry. I'd like to see, or I hope that the U.S. people realize these policies are really against anti-inflation. In other words, having protectionism worsens inflation, right? So I just hope that American people or American, say, politicians realize what the U.S. is trying to do is to protect national industries to lead to or worsen inflation. This is our first point I wanted to make. And second point is that it is true that it's very difficult to draw a line between military related technology and commercial technology. And that, I understand that. But what I hear from Japanese firms is that this, say, definition of these products, whether they are sensitive to the national security or not, drawn by the US government, that I understand. But the information is not really spread evenly or fairly to firms in different countries. In other words, US companies, maybe for obvious reasons, have better access to that information compared to Japanese firms. So Japanese firms are in a disadvantageous position in gaining or getting information about the US trade policy. In this case, the definition of products which are subject to restriction or not. So what I think Japanese firms like to see is a greater transparency in the US trade policy. These are 2 points which I wanted to kind of raise about the US policy. Maybe Jeff can tell us about what he thinks about these 2 comments. And then quickly on the Japanese strategy to deal with this China policy. Obviously, like other countries, Japan is trying to diversify the sources of imports, and by, of course, expanding their supply chain networks to other countries, and at the same time trying to develop a domestic capability so that Japan does not have to rely too much on China. Okay. And many Japanese firms are kind of shifting their investment destination, from China to other countries, and not because of this increasing uncertainty or threat politically, but also because of rising wages in China. So they're responding to these changes, I think, quite rationally. Okay. So I guess that's the strategy Japanese firms, and also Japanese government is trying to help Japanese firms to adopt this strategy. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. And Professor He, Korea, of course, depends on very heavily the Chinese rare earths and urea solution and even cobalt, manganese, so forth. And then the U.S. restricts Korea to export our, high level the semiconductor equipment and even the advanced chips to China. So how we should take the optimum balance between the U.S. policy and Korea's dependence on these strategic materials from China?
Well, yeah, that's a very difficult question. The optimal balancing between United States and China. But Janet Yellen last month gave a speech at Johns Hopkins University. And let me introduce her exact wording, okay? We will secure our national security interests and those of our allies and partners, and we will protect human rights. Within that context, we seek a constructive and fair economic relationship with China. We seek cooperation with China on the urgent global challenges of our day. Okay? So I think Korea is pretty much on the same page with United States, and healthy economic engagement with China in the framework of principled diplomacy will be the basic stance of South Korea. And also, as you mentioned, that the supply chain, especially a supply chain in the critical mineral, is getting more and more important. South Korea has a lot of concern because it's also heavily dependent upon China. So let me briefly introduce the Korean government's strategy to secure the resilience of a supply chain. Basically, Korea government's objective is, I'm not representing Korean government, but this is what I know. The Korean government's objective is to be the hub of global value chain. And it wants to accelerate the inflows and outflows of foreign direct investment to diversify the suppliers, and wants to create the innovative environment for especially high-tech industries. So Korean government is making every effort utilizing bilateral, unilateral, multilateral cooperation architecture to secure resilience of supply chain in this critical mineral or critical raw materials. For example, bilateral channel, Korean government initiated so-called Trade and Investment Promotion Framework, okay, TIPF. And this year, for the first time, Korean government wants to achieve more than 20 TIPFs. And the TIPFs comes with cooperation, economic cooperation with MOUs, okay, in the critical minerals. So this year already achieved 6 MOUs with Vietnam, Indonesia, Australia, Mongols, Canada, Mozambique. And then Korean government wants to expand ODA for resource-abundant countries. Also want to make mineral swaps with United States, EU, and Japan. That's a bilateral channel. Another bilateral channel is that when Korea want to make a new FTA, it's not full-fledged FTA, but more like an EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement style. Korea wants to include supply chain chapters, and 10 countries are targeted in Central Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe in 2023. For example, REE, rare earth element with Mongols, manganese with Georgia, nickel with Tanzania, clean energies materials with Morocco, lithium with Serbia, etc. Okay. And the last bilateral channels is upgrading. When upgrade existing FTA, Korea want to focus on supply chain too. So the FTA, already existing FTA with Chile, India, UK, RCEP, China, Indonesia are the targets. And also, Korea wants to make active participation in multilateral cooperation and the new formation of supply chain in the area of critical minerals and raw materials. For example, we know that IPEF, Pillar 2 supply chain is concluded recently. And then Korea also want to actively get involved in MSP, which is a mineral supply partnership initiated by the United States. And then CRMC, Critical Raw Material Club, initiated by EU. And then IEA, International Energy Agencies by Australia. And not only for the multilateral or plurilateral architecture, that Korea is a member, but also the other international groups that Korea wants to closely monitor and seek cooperation in the future. For example, PGII, it's about global infra investment in G7, Quad, USMCA, US-EU ITTC, US-Taiwan TTC, and the US-Japan Critical Mineral Supply Chain Agreement. So my last comment is that, well, I think this bilateral approach has some kind of limit because utilizing economies of scale in extracting and processing these critical minerals can make a big difference in terms of cost. So securing an alternative supply chain for critical raw materials by collective efforts became an urgent task for many countries which are highly exposed to the possible threat and coercion from China. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, sharing the various Korea's initiative to ensure the supply chain resilience and by outsourcing various strategic materials with a lot of the resource-abundant economies. Gentlemen, I want to move on this middle power coalition issues. I have already said that the US and China play their protectionist game for their national interest at the expense of smaller economies. I think some middle powers need to raise our collective voices against the self-motivated protectionism by the big powers, namely the US and China, to preserve a rules-based free trade order. Can the like-minded middle powers play a strategic autonomy game? You know, the APEC was born by middle powers initiative to become now a global entity for economic cooperation. Can middle powers make both the US and China listen to the middle powers' concerns in preserving liberal order? Now, some critics, Jeff, saying that US is now spoiler in chief and the global free trade order. And DEPA, for example, can grow into bigger entity. Prime Minister Lee Hsien-loong, Singapore asserted that most of the ASEAN and, for that matter, East Asian economies do not want to be forced to side with either US or China in economic relations. So, in this regard, how you see middle powers the attempt to raise our, voices against a unilateral coercive trade policies as going on now by the US. Okay, not to mention China. I mean, this is a feasible concept, or is it worthwhile for us to attempt to do that? Yeah.
Well, I disagree with your premise that the United States and China have walked away from the international system. Mm-hmm. You're exaggerating the impact of a lot of problems that beset the multilateral trading system, and you are ignoring the extensive commercial relationship that has been maintained between the United States and China despite the trade war. In fact, trade has grown, particularly in areas not subject to trade war tariffs. But there is an important difference with third powers can sustain the momentum for new trade reform, which is drastically needed. If one looks at the multilateral trading rules, they were written in the 1980s or 70s. Some of the rules that I negotiated in the Tokyo round are still in force. There has been a lack of updating of the multilateral trade rulebook since the launch of the World Trade Organization in 1995. And so a lot of things are different in international trade today that require new rules and guidelines. And the WTO, for a variety of reasons, primarily North-South frictions, but also some U.S.-China frictions on big issues like state support for state-owned enterprises, have hamstrung the ability of the World Trade Organization to reach the type of agreements that were done in the 20th century. This is where the mega regional arrangements like RCEP, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, have stepped in the void and have begun to rewrite the rules that apply for the participating countries. Now, the big problem in that progression and advance has been the United States stepping away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was a big strategic blunder. One of all the things that Donald Trump did to hurt the United States and the international economic system, this is probably one of the most drastic mistakes and blunders. But who saved him? Japan and Australia. They refused to allow the hard work over years to develop the advances in the trade rulebook to be thrown away. And so they turned the TPP into the CPTPP, which is now got new momentum with the conclusion of accession negotiations for the United Kingdom. That opens the door to a lot of new members to progressively come in to join the CPTPP, broaden its economic footprint, and make more standard the new rules that have been included in the CPTPP. This is a great advance, and it's been done by third powers. And other countries are now looking at this and saying, this is how we can take sort of safety in numbers, but also new strength in numbers, in alliances, to try to influence the movement towards new trade and investment reform. And it's interesting that the RCEP countries are increasingly looking at participation in the CPTPP. A number of them are already members, but you're seeing a merger or an upgrading of RCEP by the individual actions of individual RCEP countries. And I regret to say that the problem in RCEP is that India stepped out of it and has put itself at a great strategic disadvantage because of that. Because the supply chains are being rerouted through RCEP and the CPTPP. They're moving out of China, and the United States is not getting the preferences because it's not in the group. So that's the cost to the United States of the Trump blunder. That's been continued under President Biden. But it shows that third countries can take a leadership role in keeping the progress of trade liberalization moving forward.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I want to be provocative to draw you, answers like that. Professor Urata, I think the middle powers can still exercise some, strategic autonomy in dealing with the deglobalization trend by superpowers. For example, I think we can work together, middle powers, to revive a defunct WTO system by pressing the United States to appoint the judges for the appellate body. We can form a really middle power alliance to ensure this revival of the WTO system. What do you think about it?
Yes, thank you. Let's see. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Jeff already told us that the middle powers, I like the expression middle powers rather than third group or third, whatever Jeff said. And I think middle powers have proven to be effective in dealing with some of the problems that we are faced with. Professor An, you raised the issue of appellate body, and I guess you all know that the EU, Canada, even China, and many countries, and finally Japan this March, joined this MPIA, multi-party interim mediation arrangement, arbitration arrangement, right? And that is another example that the middle powers can contribute to dealing with some of the problems that we are faced with. In this regard, I'd like to see Korea join MPIA, and that will maybe put pressure on the US to deal with this problem. Again, I think middle powers, Korea, Japan, Australia, Singapore, you name them, and even maybe EU can be considered as a group consisting of middle powers. These countries can certainly contribute to deal with some of the problems. And at the WTO, which has 164 members, decision-making process is basically consensus, right? And it is almost impossible to have a consensus with this large number of members. And so the countries have decided, I think, to deal with this problem by taking basically two approaches. One is FTA, and that led to large or regional groupings like CPTPP, RCEP. That is a collection, or that is the kind of amalgamation of the FTAs. And the other approach is plurilateral agreements, right? Like a government procurement agreement in 1979, and also digital trade has been discussed as a group under the, I think, name of a plurilateral agreement. So WTO members try to deal with this difficulty in decision making by taking these two avenues, two approaches. And I think this is, and each one of them, plurilateral agreements, FTAs, I think middle powers are playing very important roles. So again, I think middle powers like Korea and Japan can get together and to make changes. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Dr. Panda? India has been very well known in playing the middle power, the politics in international, political relations. Now, for the India to play a crucial role as a middle power, India should open Indian economy to a more regional, to the level of regional architecture like the RCEP and the CPTPP. So how would you see, India would proceed along this line to play a middle power role in terms of this liberalizing the Indian economy?
Yes, I think I would agree with you that Indian economy is still not very much an open economy. And I think I agree with the previous commentator that India's withdrawal from the RCEP, after being one of the founding member in terms of negotiating the RCEP for many years, and withdrawing at the last moment from the RCEP negotiation from the final deal, was a huge setback. And I think that does not really give a positive image to India as an economic power, particularly when it comes to the trade liberalization and integration with the regional economies. While saying that, I think there are already a lot of corrective measures are happening in Indian economy and Indian foreign policy that needs to be noted down. One corrective measures is that after India has withdrawn from RCEP, we see that India is still reconsidering to have much more concentrated, unilateral-oriented free trade area mechanism, FTA kind of arrangements, or SEPA kind of arrangement, Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement kind of arrangement with specific economies, not in big groupings, but in smaller unilateral groupings. And I think that's a positive inclination. For example, India decided to be a part of IPF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And if we look at the IPF economic frameworks, criteria and negotiating patterns, yes, there are some differing points between IPF and RCEP, but it is not entirely a different framework. And I think the very creation of IPF is an arrangement between CPTPP and RCEP. So keeping that in mind, it's a positive inclination that India agreed to become a part of the IPF from the beginning, even though we know for a fact that IPF has not really moved much ahead. There are still not much substance within the IPF. The other example can be cited is that when India decided to sign the FTA-like agreement, which is more considered as a kind of advanced SEPA kind of agreement with UAE, and in the West Asia, it is having I2U2 with the United States of America, with UAE, with Israel and India, new kind of quad in the West Asia. this kind of arrangement indicates that India is open to the idea of having a open trade FTA-like arrangement, but India is unable to gain enough confidence to become a part of this nexus outrightly. But I think there are few other things that India is doing in order to make that course correction. One, trying to promote quality and resilient infrastructure. Japan is emerging as a critical partner with that regard. ASEAN is emerging as a critical partner. I think South Korea in the process will emerge as a critical partner. And that's a positive inclination, because the more resilient and quality infrastructure India develops, Indian economy will be more competitive, and India will be inclining to join the FTA agreement. The last point is that I think India is also looking at the free trade agreements and the regional economic environment from a perspective of science and technology, clean energy, and trying to have more specific way of collaboration in specific sectors, let it be semiconductors or batteries. And I think these are some of the areas where Indian manufacturing industries are entering into kind of co-production mechanisms with foreign economies, be it South Korean economies or Japanese economies or few other economies. I think that's a positive inclination within economic policies of India and foreign policy that is noticeable, which indicates that in times to come, India will be much more open to become a open trading partners with the regional trading environment in Indo-Pacific and beyond.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor He, would you like to add any other component for Korea's attempt to deliver some international public goods as a middle power, and how we establish our relationship like the Canada, Australia, and Indonesia, some great middle powers in the region? Okay, quick comment, okay, please.
So I didn't know that Professor Han, you will ask separately about this middle power coalition, so I answered already. But my point is simple. To some degree, yes, okay, CPTPP, RCEP, and all the consortium of middle powers can contribute to the restorations of rules-based liberal order. But still, I think until the major players of the global community, like the United States, EU as one entity, and China on the center stage to promote free trade, the effectiveness of all the efforts of this middle power coalition would be still limited. That's my point. And then second, yes, CPTPP, RCEP, all important, how can I say, policy device, international, public goods to promote free trade and put the global trading system right on the track. And in case of Korea, yes, Korea is a natural partner of CPTPP, but still, by political judgment, Korea has a general election next April, and as you know, the CPTPP is another way that Korea makes FTA with Japan, and still anti-Japan sentiment is widespread in Korea. So Korean government is, I think that's my feeling, a little hesitant by political judgment to declare, the interest in the CPTPP.
Okay, well, gentlemen, we have only now 10 minutes left, okay? Oh, audience? Yeah. Well, I have the one more agenda, okay? Let me go over it very quickly. We have a bunch of the regional and unilateral architectures ranging from security, trade, and functional mechanism, CPTPP, RCEP, Quad, IPEF, etc. In particular, 7 economies, including Japan and Australia, belong to both RCEP and the CPTPP. Now, China applied for the CPTPP membership. If China undertakes domestic reforms on the area of labor and environmental standard and IPR enforcement to the level of the CPTPP standard, and the US and South Korea joins, we should be able to amalgate two mega deals to make it a greater building block for multilateralism. G7 leader declared a de-risk China, not to decouple China. So how about the idea of this, this China's the entry to CPTPP for eventual the amalgamation of two mega deals? Jeff, okay, you take the time.
Well, I've written extensively about this, but time has passed you by, so your assumptions are a bit obsolete. China has already applied.
Yeah.
The United States has already pulled out. Mm-hmm. Korea has stayed on the fence. So with the conclusion of the accession negotiations with the UK, the Chinese feel that they are next in line to start negotiations with the CPTPP countries. That's a problem because China will not be able to meet all of the standards of the CPTPP. It can meet many of them over a transition period, but there are some areas with regard to labor practices, with regard to data, and a few other areas where Chinese practices will not suffice. There will be arguments by Chinese negotiators to say, we are doing experiments in the Hainan Free Trade Zone that will bring us up to standards over time. This is our negotiating laboratory. It will be very hard to get all of the CPTPP countries to say no to China, and so those negotiations will drag on. And while they drag on, it will make it difficult for the United States to come back in, because the United States coming back in would essentially put a veto. Give a veto to the United States to block China from coming in. So that would be regarded as anti-Chinese. So the United States missed its chance at the start of the Biden administration to come back into TPP. China took advantage and applied, effectively blocking some options for the United States in returning. And that's a shame.
Okay, Professor Urata, Japan is, in a sense, on the driver's seat to expand the CPTPP membership, and of course, South Korea is, on the right queue. We should join as soon as possible. What do you think about this? China's prospect, even though Chinese claim that, they are carrying on all kinds of domestic reforms to meet the threshold standard to join the CPTPP. How are your frank assessment on the China's attempt?
Well, I agree with Jeff about the difficulty for China to accept some of these chapters. I guess in addition to what he said, I guess state-owned enterprise is another one which is very difficult for them to accept. On accession issue, I think this UK experience, UK's accession experience, will be a very good one because I thought UK's accession negotiation, to me, it did take much longer than I expected. I thought, it will be very short for the UK to go through negotiations. But as far as I understand it, CPTPP members are very careful in assessing whether UK positions are acceptable or not. So this gives a very good precedent. It is very difficult negotiation. And so this is a good signal to Chinese and other countries which applied to access the CPTPP. And another thing is that, if I'm not mistaken, before they enter into negotiations, applicants have to have discussions bilateral discussions with CPTPP members. And after they go through this, CPTPP members discuss whether they can start negotiation. That's my understanding. And I don't think Japan and China has even had these discussions yet, right? And so from this, based on this kind of information, I think China's accession to the CPTPP will be very difficult. But as Professor An said, if China can, satisfy these conditions, they should be accepted. But one, I think, important, point that I'd like to make is that, China has a record in WTO dealings, maybe may not be so optimistic, right? And RCEP is a good, maybe possible framework where we can see whether China can abide by the rules or China does implement the commitment that they have made in RCEP. And so in order to see whether China can accept some of the CPTPP chapters, and these kind of experiences that China has had already and China will have in the RCEP framework would be I think, good indicator to look at. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Before the opening, maybe perhaps quick questions to floor. Jeff, let me ask one, question. Since you made such long, the cross-Pacific flight, and on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, I think last week the trade ministers at the sideline of APEC meeting and agreed on the supply chain resilience, the pact. I have a question. I mean, without the market access, this agreement could be effective and enforceable to ensure a rule-based free trade deal mechanism?
Well, first of all, you don't know what they agreed to, and they haven't agreed to it because they said they are close to agreement. But it's essentially, as I understand it, an information sharing exercise to better prepare or to prevent future supply disruptions and to manage disruptions if they occur. Now, how does that differ from what private companies already are doing under various antitrust or competition rules with each other in managing their own supply chains? Are they going to give governments information that they don't already give to governments? Is that part of the deal where the companies have bought into this public-private partnership? Or are they going to be compelled by governments to provide more information? And that, of course, could have impacts on competitiveness, on investment in these companies. So there are a lot of unanswered questions.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing your views on this. Let me open the floor for very quick questions, and we have just a couple of minutes. Okay, please identify yourself and.
Thank you. My name is Dong Xiangrong from Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. It's a great honor to hear all of your presentations. And my question goes to Professor Jeffrey Schott. Do you think that IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, is a substitute of CPTPP for the United States? Thank you.
Very, very quickly, it is a small step towards redressing the mistake of leaving the TPP. It is not comparable in terms of its substantive coverage, but it does mark a re-engagement of the United States with many of its Asian trading partners, but not all.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Dominic Phillips from East Asia Foundation, and I also had a question for Mr. Schott. I agreed with the point that domestic politics really is in favor of protectionism very much so in the U.S. And I mean, I changed my mind personally about what the TPP and things like that after leaving the U.S. and moving and seeing other perspectives. So do you think that it's possible that the U.S. will ever return to the kind of free trade, like fully free trade promoting policies, or is a different era here?
We never had a fully free trade promoting policy. There were always trade-offs. You can go back to the Trade Act of 1962, where President Kennedy made trade-offs with the labor unions to buy their support for basically GATT trade tariff reforms. But what has changed is that in the past, the trade protection was designed to protect industries and companies. And what the Biden administration is trying to do is change the distribution of the benefits of protection, not the benefits of trade, so that they protect workers. Any economist will tell you that's not a very good idea to protect jobs. If you want to protect people, you provide income support. But this is essentially the root, the foundation of Biden's protectionist policies, that he wants to ensure that workers, and particularly unionized workers, get a bigger share of the pie, even if the pie is shrinking.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think our time is up for this session, and I really would like to thank to our distinguished panelists for the very valuable contribution to this session to make sure a better and stable geo-economic system in the world. Let us, applaud with our distinguished panelists. Thank you very much.